All right, and if you couldn't tell by the wardrobe change and how excited we are, oh my gosh, we've been teasing this out for 2 days now. We are such fans. We are so happy that Solomon and Patrick agreed to come and join us and to do our final closing keynote of our amazing Cube Crash Innovation Day. So let's bring in Solomon and Patrick. Hi.
Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Hi.
I'm gonna remove
Thanks for
myself.
having us.
I'm just gonna. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll just sit here and fan out the whole time. So we're gonna go backstage and be like so excited about this talk. But we'll help monitor the chat as well, and we'll come in with questions at the end. And I know, Patrick, I believe you have a hard stop, but Solomon, if you can stay a few extra minutes, if there's a lot of questions from the audience, we can curate those towards the end.
Thanks.
Sure.
Awesome t-shirt.
Hey, Patrick.
Hey, Solomon. Long time no see.
Long time no see.
So, hi, everyone. So this is Solomon Hykes. He started the container movement. That was 10 years ago, 15 March of 2013. You gave a Python lightning talk that changed the lives of many developers. I was part of these developers that looked at that. I was at Microsoft back then. I'm back there today. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, this is going to transform the way we build and ship and run software. And like we're 10 years later, I can see that in my work at Microsoft every day, where many of the products that we're using, they're running in containers. We're using containers in many of our products. It's true across the software industry. So that was something that really changed the lives of everyone. The theme of this conference is innovation. And the two of us worked for 4 years together during my tenure at Docker. And I consider you one of the most innovative engineers I worked with. And one of the things I always admire about the way that you're looking at innovation is that you have a process around it. So you successfully mix, I'd say, art and method, which to me is the secret for great software engineering. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about what is the Docker origin story? How did you assemble these primitives together, namespaces, C groups, a union file system, to create that really magical user interface that Docker became to this? So can you talk a little bit about the process
Sure.
and the history there, Solomon?
Sure. I'll try to recall some useful parts, and you can maybe help me steer if it goes too far in one direction. The starting point is obsession, So I just was obsessed with a few topics early on, even as a student, and then not knowing any better, just kept pursuing them for a really long time. And I guess the starting point is 2013 when we launched Docker was the moment where it started working. People started actually caring. But there was another 5 years before that where me and others were just sort of still doing things that seems not that different. So it was kind of baffling to us a little bit that it was so successful then and not in the previous iterations. But yeah, for me, it started out as a student just being obsessed with, I guess, two things. One was this general concept that, you could program not just one computer at a time, but a whole bunch of computers together, right? It was the beginning of, cloud was barely a term, but I remember the term infrastructure being used. Think infrastructure, not servers. You could throw out any one server and then the whole will continue. It will heal and it'll keep running. I remember that blowing my mind. And then in parallel, there was a lot of interesting work around the state of a machine or a cluster or a data center and managing changes to that state. So there was the beginning of configuration management. Puppet at that time was very new. I think Chef didn't exist yet. There were many others that are forgotten. And I just thought that was really interesting. But the problem was you always manage the state of the machine from the inside. So you didn't have an object that you could look at and say, oh, this is the state now, and I want it to be that. And that seemed like an important primitive, and so eventually, we stumbled upon this primitive of lightweight virtualization, like it was called at the time. And that existed already. You mentioned C groups and namespaces. That did not exist in the mainstream Linux kernel yet. You had to patch the kernel. So we started experimenting with patching the kernel. vServer was a popular patch. OpenVZ was the best for sure. And LXC did not exist yet. It was, that appeared later. And we didn't invent any of that. And a lot of people used it to great effect. But the thing that nobody else did was use it as an application layer tool, as opposed to another kind of a VM. So when you talked about containers, you said you would ask something like, okay, what kind of virtualization do you want to use? Do you want to use heavyweight virtualization? Like, at the time, the Xen patch, prior virtualization was early, or VMware, or do you want to use lightweight virtualization, something like OpenVZ and vServer? But it was a spectrum. There was only one dimension, right? No one built a container from an application. That wasn't the thing at all. And no one stacked VMs and then containers on top. That was just, I don't think when we had that idea, we thought it was the dumbest thing ever. We just thought it was cool. So it was just like a hack. Anyway, so we just pursued that. And it just took 5 years to catch on. I think in big part because we were total outsiders. We didn't know anybody. We barely knew anything. We were just engineers living in France, just reading these mysterious blogs and hearing about what was happening in Silicon Valley. It was like Hollywood for us. We didn't know anybody there. And also you had to patch your kernel. And that was a pretty, that was a lot of friction. So it took a while. But I'm kind of rambling now. But again, because I'm obsessed with the topic. But the key is we just followed our obsession with the topic, not knowing how successful it would be, how popular it might be, or even how useful it might be. We just thought it was cool. And then eventually we survived long enough and iterated enough that I guess we got lucky and we were in the right place at the right time.
Thanks. So obsession, having an opinion.
Yeah.
An opinion about the topic, because you had opinions about how.
Many opinions. Yeah, many opinions, which now are taken for granted. I think I talk to people now that weren't around before Docker became sort of mainstream, and so I realize there's things that are now taken for granted, which is very strange for those of us who were there before, And I think now there's sort of a mainstream simplified story where, containers existed and Docker came along and they slapped like a pretty UX and some marketing. And now people knew about containers, but they existed. And, it's more complicated than that. One important aspect where we had an opinion that was not popular at all was that the container would be an artifact, for the application. And for that, you needed to use copy on write file systems. You needed to use layered file systems, and you need to define some sort of a packaging format. And then you needed to define rules for a sandboxed runtime environment for that artifact to be useful. So you needed both. You needed runtime and artifact. So you needed to kind of create an ambiguity of what a container is. Is it an execution environment, like namespaces and C groups, or is it like a shipping container, a thing that you ship, that you move around? And I think that ambiguity continues to exist today. But the reality is it has to be both. Otherwise, neither really is useful. So that was not a little bit of UX or marketing. That was engineering. It was design. It didn't exist before.
Yeah, exactly. To me, putting these things together into a single concept that became the container that is well accepted today, that was what was completely novel and really took off and became an impressive success. Talking about the next stages after the innovation happened. So you had, as I understand, I think you had a prototype at PyCon during that demo. Then with the team, you worked on a version in Go of that became the Docker code base that was one of the most successful open source projects in the history of open source. And then there
better or
was
worse.
Exactly. Can you tell us a little bit about that evolution from the initial prototype, building the Docker code base and having that massive open source success, and then the cleanup of this with the Moby project, Containerd, BuildKit,
Yeah.
OCI,
Oh, man.
etc.?
I don't know that we have enough time to cover all of that, but I'll try a few key points here. But yeah, so basically what happened is, we had this, I mentioned we had many iterations. So 2008, we had this open source tool to manage Linux containers, like I described, and that never took off because you had to patch your kernel, and that was all written in Python. It used, anyway, I won't go through the whole stack, but no one used it. That's the point. And then eventually we went through Y Combinator in 2010, and they told us, hey, you got to solve a problem for someone, but there's so many problems we could solve. This is unique technology. Yeah. Just pick one problem, So we said, oh, well, there's this thing, Heroku, platform as a service. They have tooling to make it easier to deploy, and they also host kind of all in one. So we said, oh, we'll do that. And they only supported one language, Ruby. And with our container magical thing, we could easily support multiple application stacks. Again, something that now we take for granted. So we launched this thing called .cloud, and it was like Heroku, but many languages, etc. And so we could run databases in containers also. And so a few years of that, and then we realized PaaS is a terrible business. It's just really painful, and you're just spending all this money to create leads for AWS, basically. So we spun out that open source engine, and we showed a prototype of that at PyCon, and that took off, almost immediately. So there was so much excitement around that we just had to drop everything and just support that. And the next few years, that was just the tornado of trying to keep up. Basically, there was this community that appeared overnight, and we had hundreds of pull requests a week, and just reviewing them was tons of work, and people expect rapid response. And there's all these missing features now. All of a sudden you have to build all at once, networking, storage, logging. It's got to integrate into the existing infrastructure stack. So that was just a lot of keeping up. It's kind of a blur. What was your question again? The transition to the Moby, etc.
Kind of a blur.
Yeah.
I remember at the time we called it surfing the tornado. That's really how it felt.
Surfing the tornado. Yeah, there's this famous book, Crossing the Chasm, that it's well known. How do you get to product market fit? And there's this sort of big gap that you have to cross over, the chasm, and I remember reading that early on. And then this happened, and we were like, oh, okay, we crossed the chasm. Now this is also actually very painful in a different way. We're not ready for this. This might actually kill us. And turns out there's a second book called Inside the Tornado, written by the same author, that talks about how to survive the second phase when you've crossed the chasm, and it might actually kill you. That's what the book says. So so then we were trying to learn how to surf the tornado. That was fun. But one highlight there was that Docker became successful in part because different audiences, it solved a different problem for different communities. And, it took us a while to realize that, but there was a lot of misunderstandings early on what it was for and who it was for. And to simplify to the extreme, you had developers and you had operators, infrastructure people. And we started out with Docker as a component in your infrastructure stack, in your overall platform that you were building, because that's what we were doing, right? So it was for other systems people. It wasn't to develop an application. It was for someone else to build a platform. And so there was a community around that. And now today, we're at KubeCrash. So the Kubernetes community is the continuation of that. It's not really a developer-focused community. Maybe that's not a popular thing to say, but it's about infrastructure, running huge clusters and making them scale and making them secure. And it's super successful now. But also, the relationship to Docker as a brand, as a product, has not been always the best, because here's this other community also asking us to do things with Docker, and they want to use it as a development tool. They want it on the desktop. They want, a service composition tool. So they want Docker build, they want Docker compose, they want Docker desktop. And they have very different expectations, but it's all somehow tied. So just figuring that out in the middle of the tornado was really hard. And you mentioned the Moby project. That was our attempt to separate, give each community their own space to do what they wanted to do. The infrastructure community wanted small, loosely coupled components that you could just focus on improving without too much scope creep, and competitors could build and they could compete on the product and could collaborate on the component. And we had just many of those components. I think today CNCF plays the role that we envisioned Moby playing. And, maybe that was arrogance for us to think that one company could do it all, but it's hard to realize just the craziness at that time where everyone just talked about Docker all the time. Everyone came to Docker for everything. We were asked to provide solutions for all of those components. And so, we tried, and then Docker was to be the developer facing brand. And I think we didn't have the foresight to do that ahead of time. So we tried to execute that split later, and that was very painful. But I think now it's kind of settled into a successful state. Like Docker is now a developer-focused company. From what I heard, is doing great now. And then you have Containerd, Run C, BuildKit, Notary. These individual pieces that are sort of narrowly continuing on their narrowly focused scope. By the way, I brought my Containerd t-shirt.
Awesome. I feel underdressed.
I have swag too.
Nice.
Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that answers it well. I think the cleanup after the innovation that created that tornado, the period of cleanup, creating a standard, creating different components, like Containerd is in every Kubernetes distribution today. Wherever you're running container, there's a high chance that it's Containerd running them. For build, everyone's using BuildKit. I think there are a few alternative open source projects around that, but the fact that we standardized all this in OCI makes it so that many tools can coexist. One of the things you talked about was the Docker desktop. So having the company now completely pivoted towards the developer audience. And I remember conversations we had back in the days about, hey, should we cater to ops or more on the dev side? Can you tell us a little bit about Docker Desktop? Because creating Docker Desktop itself was an innovation story within Docker. And I remember participating in that and being really impressed by the process there for how we got there. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's related to what I was mentioning around these two communities that over time became more clearly separated, but were forced to coexist into this single place. And so had conflicting priorities, and that was causing all sorts of tensions. And the best way to summarize it is, on the one hand, developers were saying, more innovation. And the infrastructure community was saying, stop innovating, please. We need to stabilize this. And, just it needs to mature. And also we want to make money and compete separately. We want to innovate too, And so, so we started these efforts internally to, focus specifically on developers and give them what they needed separate from the core, right? And so that, the core, separating out the core was a painful, gradual, incremental, large-scale process because you have this code base that everyone's using. And you got to just slowly tease out pieces. And I think it's barely done now. For example, separate out Containerd from the historical Docker daemon. That was decided and was technically possible many years ago. But I think just last year, Kubernetes finally deprecated what they called the Docker shim, causing lots of confusion, by the way. That was like 5 years, years in the making. And that's what Docker and the infrastructure community wanted. So separately, internally, we wanted to innovate for developers. And so that was sort of not a well understood thing at the time also, because Docker as a company grew very fast, and it grew mostly with the focus on the infrastructure community because, traditionally that's where the money is. So you see VMware, you see Red Hat, you see companies like that, and you think, okay, we're doing that, we're competing with that. And so internally it was weird to say, we're going to spend our time making the Docker CLI available on the Mac, for example. That was weird. Why would you build it for the Mac? It's a server tool. Yeah, but what if a developer wants to run a VM and, like run containers? That's weird. So we had these incremental steps to improve that because there was demand for that. So in the early days, you had to use Vagrant plus VirtualBox to stand it all up. And that was painful for people. And so then we sponsored this project called Boot to Docker. It was this tiny little VM that you could install. Then we had this tool called Docker Machine. It was a CLI that could help you set up VMs to then install the Docker engine so you can connect to it. And then eventually we thought, okay, let's take it to the next level. Let's build a great developer-facing platform. And so then the process that you mentioned, we went out. This became sort of my side project, my rogue project. While everyone else was focused on making money with infrastructure products. So I went and, with your help, by the way, Patrick was instrumental in this, hired a kind of a weird crew of people. We had some friends of ours from a game development studio, like a top level mobile game studio. And they were, just turns out that world-class game teams have world-class tooling. They're really good at tooling, better than the DevOps world, better than infrastructure people. The tooling is just better. And so we just hired them. They were big fans of Docker, but as users, they were not super deep on how the C groups and namespaces stuff work. They didn't care about infrastructure, but they cared about the user experience, and they just loved. So they were the perfect user for that community. So they came on board. And then we made this acquisition of a really deep systems company called Unikernel. They were all Cambridge-based PhDs, and they had just a deep mastery of the underlying system layers, and they had also lots of ideas on how to reinvent that. And so we just added them to this project. And then we had also Anand from the Docker Compose team that was acquired from Fig, the co-founder of Fig, and he was involved in that. And also 3 young founders from a startup called Kitematic. It was like a desktop UI for Docker, and we also acquired them. And so we just kind of threw all that big mass of people. It was too many people, to be honest. So we had a little bit of thrashing. And we just said, let's go and experiment. Let's build stuff to see how we can turn this into a developer-facing platform. And we went into many, many directions, 90% of which was thrown away in the end. That was a big lesson for me. We definitely had scope creep, and it was turning into, we had this WebAssembly-based roadmap where you would insert sort of a WebAssembly runtime. And anyway, I'm not going to go into details, but we went really far. Now, some of the stuff is starting to happen now, but it was definitely too early. And so in the end, we were like, okay, this is a lot. What should we do? And we looked at the list of complaints from developers, and it was like hard to install on the desktop. File sync is slow. Networking doesn't work well. And something else I forget. And so we said, let's package this up into a desktop application. What if you could double click and you get Docker? And there's a VM in there, but it's hidden deep in those, lower layers of the Mac system. Apple had just released the hypervisor framework. We actually went down to Apple headquarters and sort of spoke to them, realized VMware had done a lot of the early work to try and make that happen. And so, we just combined really high level developer facing UX with really low level systems expertise, and then let 1,000 flowers bloom, then, threw away 90% of what was there, and then focused on solving a simple problem. And that was Docker for Mac.
Yeah, that was one of the most fun projects I participated in my career. And the lesson
it was really fun.
With that mix of people that you talked about can be really very powerful to innovate. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're innovating with Dagger right now? What's the next problem that you're tackling?
Yeah, so I'm the founder of a much smaller startup now called Dagger.io, and it's funny because we're in the Docker ecosystem now, but we're outside of Docker, and so it's much less stressful. I'll be honest. But it's basically we're applying this amazing tech that now we have, thanks to the container ecosystem, Docker and others, and we're applying it to solve a remaining problem, which is continuous delivery, continuous, CI/CD basically. Everyone's containerizing their apps, and that's great, but no one's containerizing the pipelines that automate the delivery of the apps. And it turns out the state of the art in those pipelines has just not kept up. We've spoken to, I don't know how many hundreds, maybe not hundreds, dozens and dozens of teams. And, each team thinks everyone else is this incredibly sophisticated factory where everything's just seamless and flowing through and scaling. And the reality is it's all make files and shell scripts and YAML and more shell scripts and more YAML. And it's just a horrible mess everywhere. And the best you can hope for is that you have a lot of expensive engineers dedicated to maintaining and scaling the mess, which is really just not cost effective. And it's just really, when you compare it to the application stack and the infrastructure stack, Kubernetes and everything that's around it and serverless and just those amazing cloud services, basically the glue in the middle to go from left to right is just horrible. And so with Dagger, we're trying to help solve that. We're basically making it programmable. Say, okay, all of this should be code, but so you need an API, that's powerful enough to express pipelines and code, and then you need an engine to run it. So turns out all these are just a DAG. So it's a DAG execution engine, and DAGs are really exciting to me. Kind of like containers were early on. So when you talk about DAGs, a lot of smart people in different areas say, oh, that sounds like the problem I'm solving. Maybe we should just pool our efforts and maybe we're all solving the same problem differently. So there's a little bit of that happening. It's pretty exciting to me. But yeah, we make CI/CD pipelines programmable. It's all thanks to what Docker built and is still maintaining today.
Yeah, DAGs is, if I remember, that's what BuildKit is solving. It's using DAGs internally.
Yeah. So we're building on top of BuildKit. And so we're collaborating with Docker because the core BuildKit maintainers still work at Docker, and Docker build is powered by it. And it turns out BuildKit is so powerful, you can do a lot more than building. You can just run all of your pipelines. You can run the whole DAG. So basically, you can run your whole software supply chain in a really efficient way. So and you can drive it as code. So that's something I'm excited about. But yeah, BuildKit is just an amazing piece of tech.
I agree. One thing I find really interesting, if you're stepping out a little bit and look at your career, you're always at the interface between different domains. At Docker, you outlined that the tool itself was between dev and ops. Both sides wanted to use it. What you're solving right now is another of these glue areas where it's something that happens also between dev and ops, and where there's lots of glue code happening today. So I think there's at the interface between systems is where there's lots of potential for innovation to happen.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes it feels like I'm still just solving the same problem, like my whole career, because what we're solving now, it really looks a lot like what Paz was trying to solve. The answer to this is a PaaS. You just use Heroku or .cloud, or today you would say use OpenShift or Cloud Foundry or VMware Tanzu or whatever, and clearly that model has failed, and I think the reason it's failed is this: we're talking about your factory, the factory to ship your software product, and like no two factories are the same. So you're never going to buy an off-the-shelf factory. That's not how it works. You design your product and you design the factory to ship that product together. So you need a system to do that. And I think that's the insight that really caused us to pivot away from .cloud. Is that okay? This is just not flexible enough, and we were trying to make it more customizable. But if you start from a monolithic platform that owns everything, and then you try to make it more modular, it doesn't work. You need to take a Lego approach where you design the brick first, and you make sure it scales low enough and high enough. And Docker in our mind, Docker was the first step. The original plan was we're going to break out .cloud into 12 pieces. We had a I guess now you'd call it a service mesh. We had a build service, a service mesh. We had a runtime. We had a elastic monitoring system. I mean, they're all shittier versions of what exists today, right? All these CNCF projects. But our plan was we're going to spin out one of those every 2 weeks, and it's going to be a launch. We're going to ratchet up. I think we never got to the second launch because we did launch Docker and that was it. But there's this problem. You solve it with the modular approach. You solve it with glue, like you said, and so I just feels like it's not solved. Yeah.
Yeah, and I need to run. I have another meeting. I just wanted to say that one of the things that I really find impressive here is that aspect of focusing on the same problem again and again. This is something that I've seen from other great software designers. I'm thinking about Ray Ozzie. I remember when I looked at the architecture of Lotus Notes that he created in the 90s and the one of Groove that he created in the 2000s, it was kind of a different take on the same problem with more modern technology. So I think that's something that great innovators have in common, like being interested and obsessed with the same problem and applying new technology to it.
Yeah, an obsession can be a gift. Yeah, it can be a curse too. You got to find the balance.
That's awesome. Thank you, Patrick. Solomon, if you have time for one more question, sure. I know Patrick has to run.
Thanks, Solomon. It was really great to catch up with you.
Definitely.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon. Yes. So we kind of crowdsourced a question amongst lots of developers and lots of the different companies. And I would say the number one question or sentiment or thought or thing that they wanted to hear was this was such a beloved brand, still is. You see, we still wear the t-shirts all the time. It is the number one. When I wear that t-shirt and I go into the grocery store, it's of all my shirts, and I have like 7 or 8 different Docker shirts. So I have, lots of choices, but it's the number one shirt that I wear that gets people to stop me and start talking to me of all the brands. I mean, this is such a beloved brand, and everyone was just rooting for Docker. And I think as well, rooting for Dagger IO. So I think the question everyone wants to know is, if 2023 Solomon could go back to 2015 Solomon and give you one piece of advice, what would that be?
Oh man, well, I guess let me think about this for a few seconds. Well, I think at the time, when things started working, we went from crossing the desert to drowning in feedback and interest and demand from all directions, and there was almost no transition in between, and that was very surprising, overwhelming. We weren't ready for it, and in the beginning it was just pure 100% pure joy and love the whole time. And I think we really, we put a lot of effort into that. We put a lot of effort in creating an open source community that was very welcoming and for everyone. We just made it a point to do that because I had a lot of negative experiences with some open source communities that they don't even realize it. They're not trying to push you away, but they are, and maybe just because you feel like it's a scene that you don't belong in and it's not explicitly telling you, yeah, it's fine, come in. Or sometimes they're just jerks, there's just this weird communication style. And there was a deliberate effort to do the opposite of that. And so we had all these programs, for example, to help you make your first contribution, not just to the Docker project, but to your first open source contribution ever. We put a lot of thought into that, and just sort of, I don't know how many times we would say there's no stupid question, all day long. And so it really paid off. And then things start taking off even more. And it turns out the success of that community aligned with an important moment in the industry and in business. So money became, we basically became, I think, a threat to a bunch of established businesses. And that's sort of a compliment in a way. But then, the mix of feedback became some positive and some negative. And, it's different. People give you different kinds of feedback for different reasons. And feedback is important. You got to take into account. But what I learned is the more successful something's going to be, the more haters you're going to get. And you got to switch you need to switch your mode of thinking from everything I am told is, you know, something I must get to the bottom of 100%, and I need to act on this feedback. You know, that was sort of what got us there. We just avidly listened to every single thing that was told. Like if there was a bug, we were like so desperate to fix it. You know, if you were stuck, we are like, oh, people would say, I feel like I'm not smart enough for this. We're like, oh my God, that's horrible. You know, of course you're smart. You know, that means we did a bad job. Let's make it simpler. You know, and then all of a sudden you have this flood of comment that feedback that's just not constructive. It's like for your own mental health, you have to block it off. And I think it took a long time for me to adjust to that, you know, with terrible results because they made it worse. But, you know, I would just definitely say, just take a step back, focus on the people that give you constructive feedback. Like they love you and they criticize you out of love. And then, you know, just accept the rest is going to exist. Don't try to make everyone love you. You know, that's what I would say.
Well, and I think that's great advice in every area of people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do have a bit of feedback, which is my DockerCon shirt that I was wearing from 2017. My daughters love to wear, and I banned them from wearing it because
Really?
I was like, hey, you're gonna wear it out. I needed my T-shirt, so just wanted to let you know. Yep.
You really did embrace.
I'm sure we can get you more T-shirts. I'm sure we can get you more graphic T-shirts.
You did embrace the community, as you said, in such a great way. I've been to so many meetups up in the San Francisco office. This was from one of the early DockerCons as well.
I love that one.
Yeah, the Seattle shirt is the best, where he's got the umbrella and it's raining.
I have very little Docker swag, but I did keep this. This is the little DockerCon Lego whale.
Nice.
A very rare item.
Yes.
It's the only one. Yeah.
Well, those who went to the office saw the very large Lego whale that was in there. I, of course, have selfies all over Twitter on the floor with that.
That was really
whale.
Cool.
Yeah, fun times. And I enjoyed running Docker meetups as well. And hopefully maybe I can run some Docker.io meetups in the SF Bay area.
Oh, well,
when you're ready for that. Yeah. So, no, it's been amazing to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to to sunset our innovation day, and for the third Cube crash. This was the most perfect way to end it. So really appreciate your time, Solomon, and hopefully you'll come back to another Cube crash in the near future.
I would love to. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Solomon. Take care.